I only needed shelter. But that painted eye seemed to know my name.
No coat warm enough, no family willing to claim her, no room waiting anywhere, just a canvas tool roll and $7 she had earned repairing a jeweler's glass beads. And with that $7, she bought an abandoned glass eye studio outside Rochester in Monroe County, New York, a place erased from county trade maps in 1937. The rear foundation had opened beneath one corner. Half the chimney leaned away from the roof line. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, and scheduled demolition for the following spring. Yet inside, a giant enamel iris hanging above the ruined workbench was a cork-sealed hollow no one had opened in 86 years, holding money, instructions, and a truth meant for someone with nowhere else to go. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wren Hale had been learning to see her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she noticed the things other people passed over: the blue edge inside a gray shadow, the tremble in a person's hand before an unkind sentence, the narrow line where two pieces of glass had cooled at different speeds. She learned early that what appeared smooth from a distance often carried a fault beneath the surface. Her father, Martin, had once repaired watches at the kitchen table beneath a green-shaded lamp. After Wren's mother died, he began leaving broken mechanisms untouched. He married Celia 3 years later and slowly surrendered each household decision to the woman with the quieter voice and the firmer hand. Wren's true education came from Elias Voss, an elderly lampworker who kept a narrow jewelry studio behind a cobbler's shop on South Avenue. Every Saturday, from the time she was 9, she swept powdered glass from beneath his bench and filled the brass water pan beside his torch. Elias wore one magnifying lens clipped over his left spectacle and tied his white beard with blue thread so it would not drift into the flame. He taught her to rotate a glass tube evenly between thumb and forefinger, to warm it beyond the visible edge of the fire, and to wait until resistance left the material before asking it to change shape. At noon, they shared rye sandwiches beside the annealing kiln, while small pendants cooled under a blanket of vermiculite. Glass remembers every impatient hand, Elias told her once, guiding her fingers away from a bead she had tried to force round. She understood him to mean that damage could be hidden, polished, even sold, but never entirely persuaded that it had not happened. Elias died during a February freeze when Wren was 15. The landlord cleared his rooms before she could return from the funeral. His oxygen torch, graphite paddles, cryolite rods, notebooks, and the wooden case of sample eyes he had shown her only twice were scattered through an estate auction. Wren received nothing except the canvas roll he had left at her father's house, holding 3 tweezers, a scorched file, and one narrow tungsten pick. Celia disliked the roll from the moment she saw it. She kept the house so still that cabinet doors seemed afraid to close. Receipts were stacked by date, towels aligned to their stitched edges, and every private conversation reached Martin only after Celia had shaped it into a verdict. She never shouted. Her power rested in lowered eyelids, careful pauses, and the certainty that Martin would choose the easiest piece available to him. On September 3, 2022, Wren returned from a 12-hour shift at a packaging warehouse and found a bank envelope lying open on the dining table. $200 were missing. The bills had been taken from Celia's dresser, but the empty paper band was tucked inside Wren's canvas tool roll. Celia stood near the window with both palms resting on the back of a chair. Martin kept his eyes on a chipped porcelain cup. Wren emptied the roll onto the table. The tweezers struck the wood. The tungsten pick rolled toward her father and stopped against his wrist. "I did not take it," she said. Celia lifted the paper band between 2 fingers. "Your proof is in your own tool bag." Exactly 8 words arranged with the calmness of a locked door. Wren looked at Martin. He rubbed the cup's broken rim with his thumb and said nothing. That silence completed Celia's work more neatly than any accusation could have done. Wren wrapped the tools again, put on a thin brown sweater, and left before the evening rain began. She carried no suitcase. At the curb, she waited for her father to open the door or call her name. The porch light remained steady behind the curtain. For 6 weeks, she moved east and north through places that did not ask many questions. She slept 3 nights beneath the stairwell of a parking garage in Buffalo, keeping the canvas roll beneath her head. In Batavia, a church custodian allowed her to rest in the furnace room until dawn, though the boiler clicked so loudly she slept only in pieces. She spent 1 night in the plastic shelter of a closed garden center near Leroy, and 4 more in the women's waiting room of the Rochester bus terminal, sitting upright whenever the guards passed. Her money diminished by measurements small enough to remember. $5.80 after a bus from Buffalo. $4.12 after bread, 2 apples, and a cup of soup. $2.47 after she washed her sweater and socks in a laundromat. She earned a few coins sweeping a bakery entryway, then lost them to another bus fare when cold rain made walking dangerous. By mid-October, the original $7 had somehow returned to exactly $7. A bakery owner had paid her with a $5 bill and 2 singles for cleaning flour from a clogged floor drain. She kept the money folded separately, unwilling to spend what felt less like savings than the final shape of her independence. On October 18th, Wren entered the Rundell Memorial Library to warm her hands and study the classified notices. The radiator beneath the tall window smelled of dust and old iron. Near the bottom of a county surplus sheet, beneath listings for culvert pipe and used filing cabinets, one advertisement had been circled in fading blue pencil sealed bid disposal, former Voss Ocular Prosthetic Studio, structure and contents, minimum bid, 7 Hodlark. Buyer assumes all risk, taxes, and demolition orders. Wren read the surname twice. The librarian at the reference desk, a woman with silver hair held by 2 black pins, found the property file on microfilm. The studio stood beyond the city near Irondequoit Creek, 11 miles from the nearest bus route. No other bids had been recorded. The deadline was 4 o'clock that afternoon. Wren flattened the $7 on the desk beneath her palm. Elias had never spoken of owning a building, yet he had once carried sample eyes stamped with the same name. At 3:27, she walked into the rain toward the county offices, holding the advertisement inside her sweater and the canvas roll beneath one arm. For the first time since leaving home, she was moving toward a door instead of searching for somewhere to hide. The westbound bus left Wren at a service station on Ridge Road before sunrise, 7 miles from the county line and nearly 12 from the studio. She walked east with the canvas roll tied beneath her sweater and the folded deed inside a bread wrapper. The first mile passed warehouses and fenced loading yards. The second narrowed into wet fields where bare corn stalks rattled against one another. By afternoon, her shoes had begun admitting water through both soles. She slept that night in a hay barn north of Spencerport after asking permission from a farmer who stood beneath the eaves with a red wool scarf wrapped twice around his throat. The temperature fell to 28 degrees. He gave her a horse blanket and pointed to a dry place behind the stacked bales. "No matches near the hay," he said. Wren nodded and slept with her knees drawn close, listening to mice travel through the walls. At dawn, frost silvered the nail-heads above her face. She reached Pittsford the following afternoon, where Schoen Place ran beside the canal in a row of practical storefronts. Bellamy's Pharmacy with green glass bottles in its window, Klein Hardware behind a painted saw blade, Doris Vale's Cafe with steam clouding the panes, the Erie Shoe Repair beneath a striped awning, and Boyd's Funeral Rooms quiet behind 2 clipped yews. She bought nothing. The $7 had been surrendered with her bid, leaving only 23 cents from the bakery wages. The Monroe County Clerk's Annex occupied a brick building near the old rail crossing. Wren entered through a side door marked Property Disposal and found a waiting room furnished with 3 oak chairs, a clock that gained time, and a brass radiator knocking beneath the window. The woman behind the counter wore her gray hair cut square at the jaw. A silver chain ran from her spectacles to the collar of a navy blouse. On the desk stood a black nameplate. Mrs. Helen Armitage, Deputy Property Clerk. You are Wren Hale. It was not a question. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Armitage removed a file from beneath a blotter. She did not offer congratulations. She turned each page with one finger pressed at the upper corner, as though the paper might object to being hurried. You understand the structure is condemned? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not repair the road, the well, the roof, or the chimney. Yes, ma'am. You understand the contents are transferred without inventory or guarantee. Yes, ma'am. You understand that if the demolition order is not stayed by April 1st, the cost may become yours. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Armitage studied her over the rim of her spectacles. How old are you? 19. That was not one of the legal questions. No, ma'am. The clerk's mouth shifted, not quite into a smile. She aligned the deed with the desk edge and showed Wren where to sign. The pen was chained to a brass stand. Its nib scratched through her surname, catching briefly in the paper fiber. Mrs. Armitage pressed the completed deed beneath a heavy brass seal. The stamp came down with a flat mechanical blow, and the raised county emblem appeared over the signature like a small metal sun. You will take Route 31 east, she said, then turn north on Marsh Road after the stone church. Walk 1 mile past the abandoned cider mill. At the fork, keep right on Voss Lane. The lane is unmarked, but there is a broken granite post beneath 2 walnut trees. She slid the deed across the counter, then stopped with her fingers still resting on it. Voss, she said. Wren waited. The clerk opened the file again and turned to a yellow carbon copy clipped near the back. The last operator was named Adeline Voss. Before her, Nathaniel Voss. The county corresponded with an Elias Voss for several years after the studio closed. Wren felt the wet cuffs of her sweater against her wrists. Elias was my teacher. Mrs. Armitage looked at her more directly. The lamp worker from South Avenue, yes. He wrote every January asking whether anyone had claimed the property. Same paper, same blue-black ink. After 1989, the letters stopped. He never told me. He may have believed he had more time. The clerk released the deed. Beneath it lay Wren's crumpled $5 bill and the 2 singles she had submitted with the bid. The county should retain these, Wren said. It has. Mrs. Armitage opened the center drawer, placed the money beneath a bundle of red tape, and closed it carefully. I keep unusual first payments. It discourages me from deciding that figures are the same thing as value. Outside, rain had thinned to a mist. Wren followed the directions through the eastern edge of town. Marsh Road crossed low ground where cattails leaned over black water. At the cider mill, broken slats exposed a press darkened by decades of apple juice. A man splitting kindling beside a white farmhouse watched her approach. He wore one leather glove and kept the bare hand tucked beneath his opposite arm. A black and white dog stood near the chopping block, tail level, ears raised. "You looking for the Voss place?" he called. Wren stopped at the gate. "Yes," the dog barked once. The man tapped the axe handle against the stump. "Name's Silas Kemp, that's Nell. She sounds worse than she is." Nell approached, sniffed Wren's wet shoe, and returned to the man. "Lane washes out past the second walnut," Silas said. "Keep to the grass on the west edge. Ground looks firm where it isn't. Thank you." He lifted his bare hand from beneath his arm and pointed. 2 immense walnut trees stood farther north, their branches crossing above a narrow track. Between them leaned the broken granite post described by Mrs. Armitage. Voss Lane had become 2 shallow trenches divided by weeds. Wren walked the raised center until the trees opened and the studio appeared. The building was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 30 feet long and 18 wide, built of dark red brick over a fieldstone foundation. A slate roof sagged along the eastern slope. The chimney rose from the rear wall with a split running beneath its cap. One iron downspout hung loose and tapped the masonry whenever the wind shifted. Above the door remained a wooden sign painted as a human eye. The white enamel had cracked into islands. Its blue-green iris measured nearly 3 feet across, and the black pupil held a cloudy reflection of the field. Voss. Artificial eyes fitting and repair. The key resisted twice before turning. The front door opened inward 6 inches and stopped against something on the floor. Wren pressed her shoulder to the wood. Glass shifted with a dry, granular sound. The smell reached her first: cold lamp oil, damp plaster, mouse nests, and the bitter trace of burned cork. Light entered through one unbroken window and fell across hundreds of glass eyes scattered over the boards. Some were complete shells, white and oval with delicate red veins. Others were only irises, blue, brown, gray, and hazel, separated from faces they had once been intended to resemble. Wren stepped carefully. A shard broke beneath her shoe with a thin snap. The room answered with the small echoes of a place emptied too quickly. Her fingers found an old counter beneath the dust. The wood felt greasy near a circular scorch mark. When she rubbed it with her sleeve, the grain emerged dark and close, walnut worn smooth by forearms and tools. In the back room stood a lamp-working bench, an iron annealing oven, and 2 rusted gas cylinders chained to the wall. A length of rubber hose had hardened into the shape in which it was abandoned. Beside the bench, a porcelain basin held rainwater the color of weak tea. She tasted plaster dust whenever she breathed through her mouth. Somewhere overhead, water entered through the slate and struck a metal tray at slow intervals. Tin. Silence. Tin. By dusk, Wren had cleared a space near the front wall using a broken broom and a square of cardboard. She found no working stove, no blanket, and no food except 3 peppermints fused together in a desk drawer. She ate one by breaking away the paper with her teeth. The floor was too cold to lie upon directly. She spread flattened cardboard beneath her, placed the canvas tool roll under her neck, and covered her legs with a moth-eaten fitting curtain taken from a brass rod. The painted eye above the door creaked in the wind. Around her, the loose glass shells caught the last light from the window and held it after the room had darkened. Wren closed one eye. The studio looked less ruined that way. Sometimes you have to close one eye to see the world as it truly is. At first light, Wren carried the porcelain basin outside and followed the lowest ground behind the studio until she found the well. Its stone curb had sunk on one side and the wooden cover was soft enough to dent beneath her thumb. She tied a rusted socket to a length of cord, lowered it through the opening, and heard water after 11 seconds. The socket came back cold, smelling faintly of iron but not rot. She marked the depth on the cord with a knot. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, leaning north beneath a roof patched with flattened coffee tins. One hinge had torn loose. Wren rehung the door with baling wire and cleared a path through nettles using a broken furnace shovel. By the 3rd day, she knew the floor's language. A broad pine board near the front counter gave a low complaint. 2 steps from the backroom threshold, another answered sharply. The boards beneath the fitting chair remained silent, though the joists there had darkened from an old leak. She moved according to those sounds after sunset. On the 4th morning, she walked back to Klein Hardware with the county deed folded inside her sweater. The shop smelled of kerosene, cut rope, and the mineral dust that gathered around bins of nails. Stovepipes hung from the ceiling. Glass jars behind the counter held screws sorted by length and head. The owner was a wide, stooped man named Amos Klein. The end of his right index finger was missing above the first joint, and he used that shortened hand to hold a pencil while he added figures. "You are the young woman at the Voss place," he said. Wren set the deed on the counter. "I need chimney brushes, mortar tools, stovepipe, lamp oil, and whatever keeps rain from coming through slate. That last item is called a roof. I cannot afford one." Amos looked at the deed, then at the damp shoulders of her sweater. He opened a ledger bound in cracked green cloth. "I do not extend credit to strangers, I understand. I extend it to properties. People disappear. Buildings are easier to find." Wren said nothing. He wrote Voss Studio across the top of a blank page. $25, he said. "No interest until March. You bring receipts for every improvement required by the county, and you pay something each month, even if it is 10 cents. I can do that. You do not know that yet." "No." The missing fingertip tapped the ledger. "That is a better answer." He gave her a thin government booklet titled Farm and Home Repairs for Owners of Limited Means. The cover had been mended with brown tape. "My sister learned to rebuild a porch from that," he said. "She also learned which parts should have been left to someone else." Wren carried home a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $2.10, 40 feet of rope for 80 cents, a pointing trowel for 75, 5 pounds of furnace cement for $1.40, a gallon of lamp oil for 35 cents, and 2 lengths of used black stovepipe for $1 each. Amos wrote every price in the ledger and gave her the booklet without charge. The chimney occupied most of the next 2 days. Wren removed the rusted stovepipe from the rear room wall and stuffed old cloth around the opening to keep soot from spreading. On the roof, she tied the brush to the rope, weighted the lower end with an iron coupling, and lowered it from the cracked chimney cap. The first pull stopped halfway. She worked the brush in short strokes, rotating the rope so the wire bristles scraped all four sides. Dry soot fell easily. The creosote did not. It clung in black glazed sheets, especially along the cold eastern flue where rain had entered and carried smoke residue downward. Each time the brush jammed, Wren climbed down, crawled beneath the flue opening, and broke loose what she could reach with Elias's scorched file. Her face became striped with soot. The dust worked through her cuffs and settled against the sweat at her wrists. After 3 hours, she had cleared only 4 feet. She returned to Klein's before closing and asked Amos for a length of chain. He gave her 6 feet of light links and showed her how to fasten them beneath the brush so they would strike the flue walls without cracking the brick. "Do not swing it," he said. Drop, turn, lift, and keep your face away from the opening." The next morning, slabs of creosote began falling into the firebox with the sound of broken crockery. Wren shoveled them into a lidded pail and carried them outside. By late afternoon, she could lower that brush from cap to hearth without resistance. 11 hours of work had left the flue open. She repaired the gaps around the stovepipe collar with furnace cement, waited until evening, then built a test fire from 3 dry twigs and a twist of classified paper. Smoke curled once inside the room, found the opening, and rose. Wren added split walnut no thicker than her thumb. The stove ticked as heat entered the iron. A ribbon of smoke moved cleanly from the chimney into the pale sky. Her first hot meal was oatmeal cooked in a dented enamel cup Amos had included beneath the tools. She stirred it with the handle of the pointing trowel, washed first in boiling water, and ate beside the stove while the room's damp smell retreated into the walls. The next day she began examining the workroom. She did not count every ruined object. She chose what might still contain use. There were 6 lengths of milk-white cryolite glass wrapped in newspaper dated 1934. A graphite paddle worn hollow at its center, an ivory-colored fitting gauge marked in millimeters, 3 brass iris molds arranged from child to adult size, a hand torch with a rosewood grip, a cedar box containing red glass threads fine as hair, 2 leather notebooks swollen by moisture, and the giant enamel eye that had once hung above the shop door. The sign had loosened during the night and now leaned against the front wall. Its painted lashes were nearly gone, but the iris remained intricate beneath the cracks. Gray-green enamel drawn outward in narrow rays, then crossed by amber flecks that seemed to move when Wren changed position. She carried the eye to the backroom bench. It was heavier than the rotted signboard should have been. Wren pressed the tungsten pick against the white glass. The body answered with a dense note. Near the pupil, the sound changed. The center gave a lower, enclosed knock. She tested it again. White edge, clear ring, green iris, clear ring, black pupil, hollow. The pupil appeared to be solid glass 4 inches across, fused into the enamel surface. Wren turned the sign and found a cedar disc set into the back, no wider than a jar lid and almost invisible beneath soot. The disc had no handle. Its grain followed the grain of the signboard so carefully that it might have remained unnoticed forever. She warmed the surrounding wood beside the stove, then worked the scorched file into the seam. The cedar moved less than a fingernail's width. A smell of old wax rose from the opening. Wren stopped. She cleaned the seam with a tungsten pick, placed a folded cloth over the disc, and turned it slowly with both palms. The plug released with a soft wooden sigh. Inside the hollow pupil was a narrow chamber lined with cork. The first parcel had been wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed linen. Wren loosened the knot rather than cutting it. Beneath the cloth lay Elias's small brass blowpipe, the one with 2 shallow tooth marks near the mouthpiece. Beside it were his tungsten shears, a pair of iris tweezers, and 3 graphite rods sharpened at both ends. The second parcel contained glass. There were blue, green, amber, and brown canes arranged in paper sleeves, each marked with a handwritten ratio. Some were no thicker than thread. A sealed tube held white cryolite chips. Another held powdered black glass for pupils. The last object was a rectangular tin box with a sliding lid. Wren set it on the bench but did not open it until she had replaced the cedar disc loosely in the sign and carried the lamp closer. The tin was spotted with rust around the corners. A strip of adhesive cloth crossed the lid. On it, in faded blue-black ink, Elias had written a single name. Wren. She sat down. The fitting stool creaked beneath her weight. Outside, wind moved through the leafless walnuts, scraping one branch against the roof slate. Wren ran her thumb over the letters until the rust caught her skin. Inside the tin, folded paper covered the contents. Beneath it were money packets bound in cotton tape. She opened one. Gold coins lay edge to edge, their surfaces darkened but their lettering sharp. The next packet held silver dollars. A smaller cloth bag contained half-eagles, Indian head cents, and worn buffalo nickels. At the bottom rested a bronze military medal on a faded blue ribbon engraved with the year 1918. Wren counted at the bench in rows of 10. She counted once by denomination and once by packet. Then she wrote the figures on the blank reverse of a county demolition notice and counted again. There were $20 Liberty gold pieces, $10 eagles, silver Morgan dollars, and smaller coins placed between layers of cotton to prevent abrasion. The notes were older currency, flattened and sealed in waxed paper. Some smelled of cedar. Others carried the dry metallic scent of the tin. The total came to $32,100. Not $32,100. Wren left the money in rows until darkness filled the corners of the workroom. She did not touch the folded letter beneath the last packet. Its first page showed through the paper, written in the same narrow hand as the name on the tin. She returned the coins to their wrappings, placed the metal on top, and closed the lid. Then she carried the tin outside. The creek beyond the low field had risen from the week's rain. She sat on the well curb with the box held between both hands and watched dark water move beneath pale reeds. No house light reached that far. The only brightness came from the thin strip of sky reflected in the current. She stayed until her fingers went numb. Sometimes you have to close one eye to see the world as it truly is. Morning entered through the front window in a narrow white band and reached the tin box before it reached Wren. She carried it to the workbench and set Elias's brass blowpipe beside it. The letter lay beneath the metal, folded into quarters. Before she opened it, she recognized the handwriting from the labels on the glass canes. Narrow capitals, deliberate commas, and a descending stroke on every final Y. She unfolded the pages carefully. My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, then you have found the hollow in the sign, and the studio has outlasted me. In June of 1986, Dr. Miriam Feld at Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester told me that the weakness in my hands came from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She was honest, which I valued more than comfort. I could still hold a cane of glass, but I could no longer promise that my fingers would obey the flame. This trade came to our family through 4 generations. Nathaniel Voss began fitting glass eyes in Albany in 1868. His daughter Clara brought the work to Rochester in 1894 and built this room beside the creek. Clara's son Samuel kept the furnaces through the First World War. My mother, Adeline Voss, inherited the bench in 1931 and taught me here after school. We closed the trade on November 17, 1954. Since then, these rooms have stood silent for more than 30 years. My brother Thomas did not return from the Meuse-Argonne fighting in 1918. The metal in this box was sent to our mother after his death. She kept it near the kiln, where she could see the blue ribbon whenever she worked. The money is not a prize, it is stored labor. Spend it as labor should be spent, slowly, with purpose, and only where the work cannot proceed without it. The white cryolite should soften near 1,050 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm the tube gradually for no less than 90 seconds before shaping. For a gray-green iris, use 2 parts smoke gray to 1 part pale amber, then pull the thread until it is finer than sewing silk. Fuse the pupil for 4 seconds, withdraw it from direct flame, and rotate continuously while the black settles. The red capillaries must be laid cold and sealed beneath a clear layer no thicker than 1 millimeter. The thin book contains my method for building depth in the iris. Do not copy the lines exactly. Observe living eyes. Their beauty comes from imbalance. You may wonder why this was hidden rather than given. Inheritance that arrives without work is often mistaken for permission to waste. I wanted these things to be found by someone who listened to hollow wood, noticed unequal weight, and opened old wrappings without tearing them. If that person is you, then you have already earned the first lesson. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Nathaniel Voss, January 6, 1989. Wren read the letter twice. The second time, she rested one fingertip beneath each technical instruction, following the sentences as Elias had once guided a glass tube through the cooler edge of the flame. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases and returned them to the tin without smoothing the worn corners. Only then did she open the thin book. The first page held a diagram of an eye divided into rings. The notes were precise but unfinished, interrupted halfway through a paragraph on reflected light. A line near the bottom directed the reader to Clara's mark beyond the rear sill, where the spring shadow falls. Wren carried the book through the back door. The ground there was stiff with early frost. She measured outward from the sill using the length of her shoe, then looked toward the walnut branches. Their morning shadows crossed the weeds and ended near a flat stone almost hidden beneath moss. She scraped it clean with the pointing trowel. A symbol had been cut into the surface, an almond-shaped eye crossed by a flame, the same small mark stamped into Elias's brass blowpipe. Beneath it were the letters CV and the year 1894. Wren placed her palm on the stone. It held the night's cold longer than the earth around it. Back inside, she examined the old hand torch from the workroom. Its valve was stiff and the original rubber hose had perished, but the brass body remained sound. She cleaned the burner with a fine wire, fitted it to a short length of new tubing, and connected it to the smallest surviving fuel cylinder only after testing every joint with soapy water. The first flame emerged yellow and uncertain. She adjusted the air until it shortened into a clear blue tongue. Then she held Elias's blowpipe beside it, not heating the metal, only letting the fire cast its light across the tooth marks near the mouthpiece. For several minutes she watched the brass brighten. The letter did not change what had happened to her. It did not restore the porch light, her father's voice, or the 4 winters she had spent believing Elias's tools were lost. It placed other things beside them. The farmer in the red scarf had given her a dry corner in his barn. The silver-haired librarian had kept the property file open after Wren's hands began shaking. Mrs. Armitage had explained each danger without using it as a reason to send her away. Amos Klein had opened a ledger when he might have closed the shop door. None of them had rescued her. Each had made one small space in which she could continue. Perhaps someone once gave you a kindness so modest that they forgot it before evening, though you carried it for years. What was it? A meal, a ride, a quiet word, a door held open when every other door seemed shut. Wren lowered the torch flame and shut the valve. That night she wrapped the tin box in the cleanest section of the old fitting curtain. She placed the letter, the notebook, the metal, and Elias's tools beside her bedding, close enough that her hand could reach them in the dark. The stove cooled by degrees. Beyond the wall the creek moved under the first skin of ice. The first snow came on December 2nd, and measured 7 inches against the north wall by noon. Wren read the roofing chapter in Amos's repair manual 3 times, once beside the stove, once beneath the leaking eave, and once on the ladder with a pencil between her teeth. The studio roof measured 32 feet by 21. 2 slopes joined beneath a ridge that had settled almost 4 inches at the eastern end. By her calculation, she needed 14 squares of salvaged slate, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 28 pounds of copper nails, allowing for breakage and overlap. Amos checked her figures, erased 1 line, and added 15%. "You will break more than you expect," he said. From beneath the counter he brought out a roofing hatchet with a narrow blade and a leather handle darkened by use. It had belonged to his wife's father, a roofer who had died 12 winters earlier. "Return it sharp," Amos said. A former roofer named Edwin Pike arrived the next morning wearing a brown cap with the bills stitched twice. He was 72, thin as a folding rule, and refused the coins Wren offered. "I am paid in accurate work," he said. For 11 days they stripped broken slate, exposed the old rafters, and replaced the worst eastern member with a sister rafter bolted alongside the original. Edwin snapped a chalk line from ridge to eave, then taught Wren to set each nail in 3 strokes. Place, drive, finish. That nail's proud. Wren raised the hatchet. Pull it. By the 6th day, her shoulders burned before noon. By the 9th, sleet froze on the ladder rungs. Edwin worked without haste, testing every foothold before shifting his weight. On December 14th, they set the final ridge slate. Wren climbed down after sunset and stood beneath the eave while melted snow ran through the repaired gutter instead of through the ceiling. Edwin looked up once. "That will keep weather outside," he said. January exposed what the first fire had only concealed. The outer chimney bricks had begun to spall, their faces peeling away in thin red shells. Mortar beneath the cap powdered between Wren's fingers. She removed each damaged joint to a depth of 3/4 of an inch, brushed out the dust, and dampened the masonry before packing it again. Amos mixed the first batch beside her. 3 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 1 part fire clay for the joints nearest the flue. Portland cement would be faster, Wren said. And too hard, he replied. The old brick would break around it. For 3 weeks, temperatures remained in the 20s. Wren worked from the sheltered side whenever wind crossed the field. She wore wool gloves for lifting brick, but removed them to press mortar into narrow joints because she could not feel the trowel edge through cloth. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. She warmed them over the stove, waited for the ache to return, and climbed again. The final cap required 2 attempts. The first set cracked when the temperature dropped too quickly overnight. She chipped it away, covered the second with burlap, and kept a lantern beneath the scaffold to slow the cure. On January 29th, she built a test fire from dry walnut and 1 split of maple. Smoke entered the throat, rose without hesitation, and drew cleanly above the rebuilt cap. Outside, the plume stood straight for several seconds before the wind carried it east. Wren watched until the last gray thread disappeared. The floorboards were white pine, though years of soot and lamp oil had darkened them almost black. Wren lifted the loose planks, tightened the joists beneath them, and reset each board with hand-cut rose-head nails bought from a salvage dealer in Rochester. Amos rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit paper, moving diagonally across the grain to remove old finish without hollowing the softer boards. The second pass used 120 grit. The third used 220, slow enough that the sander's hum became the only steady sound in the room. Dust settled in her hair and along the window muntins. She vacuumed twice, wiped the boards with mineral spirits, then brushed on the first coat of oil. The color rose from dark honey toward mahogany. She waited 24 hours, rubbed the surface lightly, and applied a second coat. The third required another full day and a 48-hour cure during which she entered only in stocking feet. One morning, before the final coat, she woke with a heaviness that made lifting the stove lid feel unnecessary. She carried no tools outside. She walked instead to the marsh and sat on a fallen walnut limb. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless except for the narrow turning of its head. Wren watched it for nearly 2 hours. When it finally lifted, its wings moved with the deliberate breath of doors opening. She did no work that day. The next morning she returned to the floor, stirred the oil, and finished the room before dusk. There were 8 windows in the studio. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The last held 1 original pane, faintly wavy and marked in the lower corner with 1788, preserved from an earlier building whose materials had been reused when the studio was raised. Wren removed that pane first and stored it upright between folded blankets. For the replacements, she cut glazing points into the sash, rolled deep 33 putty between her palms, and pressed it into each rabbet with the heel of her thumb. She set the glass against the bedding putty, fixed it with points spaced 8 inches apart, then drew the glazing knife in one steady pass to leave a clean bevel beneath the muntin edge. The sash cords were worse than the glass. She opened each weight pocket, removed the frayed rope, and fed 1/4-inch cotton sash cord over the pulley. At the counterweight, she tied a figure-8 knot, snugged it into the iron channel, and tested the balance before replacing the wooden cover. 1 cord slipped loose and vanished inside the wall. Wren spent an hour retrieving it with bent wire and Elias's longest tweezers. By the 7th window, her hands had learned the sequence without instruction. The final sash faced the walnut trees. As she pressed the last putty bead into place, a chickadee landed on a branch outside. close enough that she could see its black cap reflected in the new glass. It tilted once toward her, then struck the branch with its beak and flew into the February light. Wren remained at the window until the branch stopped moving. Behind the loose plaster, Wren found hand-split oak lath blackened by soot, but still firm beneath the knife. The first patch near the chimney failed before breakfast. She had mixed the lime too dry, and the edge cracked as it cured. The second sagged from the lath because she pressed too much into one coat. The third held overnight, then separated with a hollow tap. Amos brought an old burlap bag from his shed. Inside was clean horsehair left from his father-in-law's plastering work. "Cut it shorter than your thumb," he said. Wren mixed the hair into lime plaster until each handful pulled apart without clumping. Shisty forced the scored scratch coat through the lath, leaving rough keys behind it. Over that, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and waited 72 hours, keeping the wall damp with a fine spray. The final finish coat was 1/8 inch, drawn smooth with a steel trowel. When the last patch had hardened, she pressed her knuckles against it. "These patches will hold another 100 years." Doris Vale began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Tuesday before dawn. She was a compact woman with flour always caught in the crease beside her wedding ring. The first bag held 2 biscuits, a boiled egg, and half a jar of blackberry preserves. The second held bean soup in a sealed milk bottle. Each time, Wren carried the empty containers back to the cafe. Doris pushed them beneath the counter and refused the coins offered. In candles, when the shop reopened, she said, Caleb Pike arrived one Saturday on a red Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow-shouldered, and wore one trouser cuff tucked inside his sock to keep it from the chain. Without introduction, he split the walnut rounds stacked beside the wall, placing the straight pieces beneath the eave and the twisted grain near the stove. Wren brought out the coin pouch. Caleb shook his head, my mother said. "About your grandfather." Wren did not correct the family relation. She gave him oatmeal and the last of Doris's preserves. Before leaving, he sharpened the maul with Elias's scorched file and wiped the metal clean. Reverend Boyd passed the lane each morning on his walk from the church to the cemetery. He had a white mustache that lifted when he breathed and carried a blackthorn stick polished at the grip. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat toward the studio and said the same 4 words, "Keep her hands steady." Wren did not ask whether he meant hers, Clara's, or the hands of everyone who had worked there before. Wren postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door beneath the fitting counter had swollen shut. She loosened it with a pry bar, then descended 7 granite steps into a room 12 feet by 15, its fieldstone floor laid without mortar and cold enough to fog her breath. At the center rested a dressed granite slab, rectangular and unusually smooth. The iron flame craft mark had been carved into one corner. Wren tested the edge with the pry bar. The stone did not move, and she did not force it. Beneath the 3rd step, something caught the lantern light. A small oak box had been wedged into the cavity behind the riser. Its hinges were green with age, but the lid opened after a drop of lamp oil. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into the almond outline of an eye with a narrow flame rising through the center. Beneath it was a tintype. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the studio in the summer of 1903. She held a graphite paddle in one hand and wore a dark skirt with a white collar. Her face had Wren's narrow chin, Wren's uneven eyebrows, and the same slight downward turn at the left corner of the mouth. On the back, written in iron gall ink, were the words, Clara Voss, daughter of Nathaniel, age 25, summer of 1903. Wren carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the metal. She did not know what it opened. By March, snow retreated from the south wall in gray shelves. The creak grew loud enough to hear from the workbench, and yellow-green catkins lengthened on the walnut branches. Wren cleaned the lamp working tools, sorted the surviving glass canes, and repaired one burner valve. She did not begin making artificial eyes that spring. The work required steadier fuel pressure, a proper annealing kiln, and more practice than memory could provide. She chose one worn silver coin from the cache and exchanged it for white glass, clear tubing, and 3 colors of cane. On cold mornings she practiced only small samples, dots, lines, pupils, and thin iris threads drawn over a graphite paddle. Most cracked, she kept them anyway. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, on December 7, 2024, Wren completed the first die she was willing to place beneath the clear glass cover on the front counter. It was not intended for a patient. The shell was too heavy and the curve would not have rested comfortably in an orbital socket. It was a study piece built to prove that the old method could still be carried from hand to hand. She warmed the white cryolite tube through the outer flame for 90 seconds, turning it evenly until the glass softened without collapsing. Over the pale hemisphere, she laid smoke gray and amber in the ratio Elias had written. The iris threads were drawn finer than sewing silk, then fused in broken radial lines rather than perfect spokes. A black pupil settled under 4 seconds of heat. Red glass capillaries crossed the white in 3 restrained branches and disappeared beneath a clear protective skin. After annealing, the piece cooled without a fracture. Wren set it beneath the window and moved her head from side to side. The iris seemed shallow from one angle and deep from another. It looked alive enough to be honest. The studio had changed without becoming new. The repaired plaster retained small waves where the steel trowel had passed. The pine floor carried dark scars too deep to sand away. 8 restored windows admitted winter light over the walnut counter, the fitting chair, and the lamp-working bench. Elias's tools hung within reach while Clara's photograph rested in a narrow frame beside the torch. The brass key remained on the mantel until that same winter. During a thaw, Wren noticed a rectangular iron plate set into the oldest walnut tree, nearly concealed beneath folded bark. The plate bore the eye and flame mark. Its keyhole had filled with dirt and insect husks. She cleaned it with the tungsten pick. The brass key turned halfway, resisted, then opened a shallow compartment cut into the living trunk and lined with sheet copper. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, dry and carefully wrapped. Beneath it was a note dated October 2, 1918, written by Clara while Thomas served in France. She wrote that the walnut had been young when Nathaniel planted it, and that trees, like workshops, kept the shape of what had been entrusted to them. If Thomas returned, the flag was to be hung above the fitting bench. If he did not, it was to remain folded until someone could carry his medal without using loss as a decoration. Clara had ended with a practical instruction. Oil the iron plate once each autumn because grief did not excuse neglect. Wren unfolded only enough of the flag to confirm the field of stars. Then she wrapped it again and placed the note beside the medal. On November 11, 2025, she carried both to Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester. Thomas Voss's name appeared on a family marker, though his body remained in France. Wren stood there on the anniversary of the armistice while dry leaves moved across the path. She fixed the medal's blue ribbon beneath a small glass cover inside the Voss Plotz memorial box and left a copy of Clara's note with the cemetery archivist. There was no speech. Reverend Boyd removed his hat. Amos placed one bare hand against the stone. Caleb, taller now, stood beside his bicycle and looked toward the trees. Of the $32,100, Wren used 4 coins. One bought the glass for her first practice work. A second paid for a regulator and safe fuel lines. The third purchased refractory brick for a small annealing kiln. The fourth covered the county inspection fee when the demolition order was formally withdrawn. The remaining money stayed wrapped in its original packets. Wren returned it to the hollow pupil with Elias's letter, the thin notebook, and a new inventory written in her own hand. She replaced the cedar disc, sealed its edge with beeswax, and wrote 2 words on the inner face where only the next finder would see them. The next one. The shop reopened without announcement. Doris placed a white index card on the cafe corkboard between a notice for piano lessons and an advertisement for a used washing machine. VOS, Glass Eye Studio Repair Consultation, Historical Replicas, and Careful Study Work. By appointment. The first customer brought a cracked display eye from an optometrist's cabinet. The second mailed a glass shell that had belonged to her grandfather. Wren repaired neither immediately. She examined them, wrote down what could be preserved, and explained what could not. Within a year, the mailing list held more than 40 names. Some wanted restoration. Some wanted only to know whether an inherited object was handmade. 3 were medical ocularists who asked for copies of Elias's depth method. Wren shared the technique but not the money, the hollow sign, or the location of the sealed chamber. Caleb returned one April afternoon carrying a long object wrapped in an army blanket. He had become broader through the shoulders but still tucked one trouser cuff into his sock when riding. He laid the bundle across the counter and uncovered a hand-carved walnut sign. The original lettering had been copied from the faded board above the door. Voss Artificial Eyes and Daughters. Wren ran her fingers across the last 2 words. There were no daughters listed after Clara, she said. Caleb shrugged. There are now. The sign was too heavy for the old brackets. Together they mounted it on a frame inside the front window where the winter wind could not reach it. Doris brought coffee in thick cups. Amos stood across the room and judged the level by closing one eye. Left side is low, he said. Caleb adjusted at once. The sign settled straight. Years after opening Elias's letter, Wren began one of her own. She used blue-black ink and the same narrow paper kept in the workbench drawer. The first line came easily. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote no history of suffering and no explanation of why a family had failed her. She described instead the pressure required for a clean flame, the value of allowing a repaired chimney to cure, the proper way to wrap glass so separate pieces did not strike one another, and the difference between preserving a craft and pretending it had never changed. She added the names of those who had kept the place standing: Helen Armitage, Amos Klein, Doris Vale, Edwin Pike, Caleb, Reverend Boyd, and Silas Kemp, whose dog still barked once whenever Wren passed the farmhouse gate. Near the bottom, she wrote the sentence carved on the clear glass marble she had finally found beneath the lining of Elias's tin. Sometimes you have to close one eye to see the world as it truly is. She placed the marble beside the letter. Within it, the engraved words bent with the curve of the glass and straightened again when held toward the window. At dusk, Wren turned off the bench flame, covered the completed study eye, and locked the front door. Snow had begun settling on Voss Lane. The new sign remained visible through the glass, its final words dark against the warm interior. She crossed beneath the walnut trees without hurrying. The historic Glass Eye Studio waits. It has always waited. At the county annex, Mrs. Armitage retired in the spring of 2026. On her final afternoon, she emptied the center drawer of rubber bands, sealing wax, and red tape. At the bottom lay one softened $5 bill and 2 worn singles. She placed them in a plain envelope marked First Payment, Voss Studio, then returned the envelope to the drawer for the next clerk. The brass drawer closed with the same deliberate sound it had made when Wren was 19.